Hello and welcome to the ninth lecture in Justice, Ends and Means. And this week we're talking about justice in the public sector, which is a very important concept, but it's one that we need to do a little bit of foundation work before we can actually really, I think, appreciate the importance of having a public sector and a notion of a public that's the foundation or the basis of our idea of justice. And this is the concept of the public is something that we've seen really, I think, be eroded significantly in the last 10, 20 years. And a lot of people like to blame social media and say, well, no one cares about privacy anymore, and they publish everything online. But honestly, the attack on the idea of privacy and the public sector itself started well before social media was a thing. And it is a very intensely political movement, and it's a fundamental threat to a lot of our ideas of justice. So let's go back to, I guess, the start of that story and talk about, what is the public, and thereby what is the private, and why are these things so important, particularly in an era where everything's exposed to the public eye anyway. Well, our ideas of government, our Western ideas of government, which feed very strongly into our ideas of democracy, which feed into our ideas of justice, and our ideas of society and so on, are based on a fundamental split between the private and the public sphere. So the public sphere is the sphere of government, it's the sphere of community, it's the sphere in which we interact with each other, and it is there that the work of justice is done. The private sphere, on the other hand, is a refuge from the public sphere. It's the place of the person's home, the person's individual thoughts, individual liberty, and in at least liberal theory, it's always been sacrosanct, and it's been one of those lines that the government shouldn't cross. Except, of course, if you're a person who's already powerless, and then the government always has plenty of time and energy to cross that line. So there's an expression, an Englishman's home is his castle. And you notice the gendered term there, because one of the things that was always true about the public-private divide was that it benefited and protected men, and women were not considered, originally women weren't even voting citizens when these ideas were circulated. And often that divide was used to further disadvantage women, and we still have the overhang of that a bit today around things like domestic violence. For a long while, domestic violence was just considered a private matter that happened in the home, and wasn't something that there should be intercession from outside, because it was, people's private business. Now, we've changed our attitudes to that as a culture, not completely, and there's still problems with that. But I think that's one example of where this public-private divide was not always fantastic. It was not always this ideal that people think about. The other thing is that, for sexual minorities, it was never a case of privacy being a protector. I mean, for heterosexual family life and private life, that was something that was very much believed the government shouldn't interfere with. But once someone stepped outside of what was considered normal, then suddenly this right to privacy tended to disappear. So, okay, it's a problematic distinction, but it's also a very important decision. And over the years, it's been used to protect a lot of things. I mean, the Roe versus Wade in America, it protected the right to abortion, because that was considered to be something that was a woman's own decision, part of her private business, her private life, in which the state shouldn't interfere. There's an example of where that public-private divide does work in a way that we might consider to be beneficial, or it did until that decision got overturned. The other thing about the public-private divide is that there is I'm not sure if it's I guess it was a right, and this is the year, and we're talking about the classic liberalism, that rights were very important. There was a right to participate in the public sphere, and again, originally this was a very narrow set of people who were allowed to do that. But the idea was that the public sector, the government, the civil service, had a duty to protect this public sphere where people had a right to engage and a right to have their opinion heard, and so on. This is where we get things like the right to free speech. As an idea in some countries as a protected right, because you have to have this public sphere of engagement and discussion as something that is protected, unless that speech is actively harming someone, such as, inciting people to do crime, which I think a lot of people forget in their discussions about free speech today. Is people think of free speech as being this absolute right to say whatever you like and express whatever opinion you like. But there's always been this issue of, if it's harmful, directly harmful to someone else, then that's a situation where the state can intervene, because particularly if it's going to stop other people having their right to engage in that public sphere. So far, so kind of theoretical and conceptual, but it has meant that there are clear roles for things that are roles for government. There are clear roles for things that are private, that the government shouldn't be interfering with, and a whole lot of grey areas in between. It also means that the public sphere is made up of lots of different people, individuals in their own right who are participating, but also and politicians and representatives. But there's also this idea of there being a public sector, a public service, whatever you want to call it, of a group of people who serve the public interest. Their job is to protect the public sphere and to do things that serve the public. And part of that field is, of course, the justice sector. We're talking about policing, we're talking about courts, we're talking about corrections. And the idea behind this is these things are so important that they can't be left to individuals to take their own vigilante revenge against people. The reason we have a society is that we have a justice system that we struggle to try and improve at times, but the idea is that it's something that belongs squarely in the public. All right, now that I said before that this idea has been chipped away at, and neoliberalism, our old friend neoliberalism, is the main offender here. Neoliberalism we've mentioned it previously in the course, but really it's an idea of that government should be a business, that everything should be a business, that universities should be a business, that everything you do should be a business. And it comes originally out of the 80s, out of the conservative politics of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But where neoliberalism really took off was when the traditional workers' parties started embracing it. So Labor in the UK, Labor in Australia have become just as strong disciples of this idea of neoliberalism as the conservatives. So one of the reasons why it does so much damage and is so unchecked is that all sides of politics now run to this idea of neoliberalism. And one of the ideas is that government should be run like a business, and in many cases should be handed over to business. So one of the huge things we saw in the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s was privatisation of all public resources. So utilities like water and electricity. If you're a younger person, you might find it very strange that those things used to be controlled and owned by the state. And that's how successful neoliberalism has been as an idea, because in the past it was considered, well, these things are so important, we can't leave them to chance. We can't leave them to business to run them because they're centrally important. And the argument was that government is highly inefficient. Business is really efficient. We'll hand it over to business. Now, as much as people complained about Telecom back in the day, which was the Australian state-owned telecommunication system, I don't think Telstra is doing a whole lot better. And Telstra is the organisation that Australia's state telecommunications system was sold off to. So the idea of having precious, important central infrastructure owned by the people now sounds like, the most severe form of socialism, but not very long ago it was the norm. It was the way, your electricity went through your state electricity organisations. It meant that all the people got to profit from it, and it meant that there was full oversight from government. So it's been a real political and ideological victory of neoliberalism to sell these things off. And of course, when you sell off one of those big utilities, it's impossible to buy it back. And governments like doing it because they get a budget surplus in the year. You sell off something big and important like the train system or the water, and that for that year you have this huge budget surplus that you look like you're being a very wise and responsible government in doing that. But there's the greater question for history is when we look at the compromise to our infrastructure, was that a wise and responsible decision in the long run? Now, for us who are studying criminology, where the cutting edge of this, of course, is the justice system. Should the justice system be sold off the same way water or electricity or the telecommunication system was done? Now, that's a difficult sell for a lot of people. Although we have very extensively privatised areas of prisons, America is way ahead of everyone like that in the world with that. But of course, America is also now the country that imprisons more of its own people than any other country in the world. Even dictatorships don't imprison as many people as America does. So, so prisons are a popular argument in the same way that the neoliberals like to sell off everything, but there's been more resistance, I guess. And I noticed in Queensland, they've started closing some of the privatised prisons and replacing them with state prisons, which, I mean, I'm clearly someone who prefers to have, resources and important things held by the state, and has a lot of skepticism about what businesses do, because their fundamental duty is to make a profit and to give dividends to shareholders. And I'm not sure that people should be profiting from things like prisons and courts and policing. Now, we haven't had as much pressure on courts and policing for privatisation, largely because it's hard to make money out of the courts. The courts are fundamentally a big drain of money, and largely because we've seen some very scary things happen with privatised private police and private armies. Doesn't mean there's not pressure to have it, and it doesn't mean that various corporate interests don't want to elevate their own internal security people to the status of police. And again, there's been different places in the United States that have basically been able to be declared corporate. So there's corporate sovereignty. One of them is the Disney properties in Florida. Another one is there's a development zone in Seattle, I believe, where they have replaced state police with private police, along with utilities. And again, I don't think this is a argument that we're going to see go away, and I don't think there's much good to be had of this relentless push to privatise everything. Positively, I think people are a lot more skeptical about corporations these days. And I think there's a space to be skeptical about what corporations do without people necessarily having to be a socialist, I mean, being a socialist probably gives you a lot more reason to be sceptical of corporations. But I think there are people, there's plenty of space for people who are capitalist who can say, I like capitalism as a system, but there are things that corporations should not be doing, should not be running, because they need to be kept accountable. And a big part of all this picture is this erosion of the idea of the public, this disappearance of the idea of public spirit, public values, and the idea of there being people whose job it is to help everyone else. And as people who are studying criminology, this is one of the things, I guess, that's going to be part of where you're going as graduates. A lot of you will be going into the public sector, and you'll be dealing with the why is working as, you know, a corrections officer or a community justice person different from any other jobs. There are different codes of practice, there are different ethical codes, but a lot of it is that you are a part of something more and something bigger than just a private organisation. You're part of something in society. And I think part of that relationship is also going to be how we renegotiate this public-private distinction. And where we're seeing a lot of the change happening, and this is something that I'm not going to talk a lot about because it's only just starting to happen, but it's something to keep your eye on, is the creation of community spaces and community organisations. So we did see the idea of community basically reduced to local government, and local government again being chopped up into pieces and sold off to corporate interests. And in some places, local government is a corporation, which is another strange thing. But we're seeing in the last few years, and we saw a lot of this in COVID, and we saw a lot of this through things like the Black Lives Matter movement, we're seeing more development of these grassroots community movements. And I think that's where we're seeing people actually reclaim the idea of community, reclaim the idea of public, but it's a new idea of public. The old idea of public was things like politics happened and commerce happened in the public space, and what happened in people's private spaces were no one's business. We're now seeing much more of these new ideas of community being more focused on caring and understanding the people who are disadvantaged by being locked in those private spaces. So we're seeing a lot of these responses to things like domestic violence, for example, are coming out of these community groups rather than from government action. And I know this week the federal government has pledged a reasonable sum of money to help women escape violent relationships. But what's going to happen is that every scavenger and vulture is going to be descending on that money, and we don't know how much of that will actually go to anyone who needs it. And we saw that with things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and we've seen a lot of things that happen that as soon as the government releases a pot of money, it's not the community groups that go into it, it's these corporations that suddenly manage to just gobble up all the funds to administer different community projects. Anyway, we could talk about that more and more, but what I would like to leave you with, I guess, today is this idea that it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of really good work happening at grassroots community level, but that still means we do have to focus, and particularly as people who are going to work in the public sector, and I consider that I work in the public sector, working in education, I believe that's a fundamentally public thing, that we have the duty to be custodians of those ideas, of things like rights, of things like justice, of all the things we've talked about in this term, and to protect people, particularly people who are more vulnerable, from those who would take advantage of them.